This project is an Eastern Catholic church in London, and it happens that it is actually the first permanent wooden church built in the city in 350 years. It was built not just as a place of worship for the Belarusian diaspora community, but it was also built as a lasting memorial for all victims of the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Behind this project is actually a story about a country and a story about wood. It began just after the Second World War when a large number of Belarusian soldiers and their families relocated to the UK. They started to gather around this large house in North London, converting one of the rooms into a temporary church, which remained their temporary church for the next 70 years. The community started to flourish around this place, and they always wanted a proper church building one day. Fast forward 40 years, in 1986, Chernobyl happened, the worst man-made environmental disaster in history. Many villages in Belarus like this were destroyed as a result because 70% of the radioactive fallout actually fell on Belarus. The community wanted a meaningful building to which they could relate, but I knew very little about their culture, so I decided to travel extensively in their country to research and to record their heritage by hand. The country used to have many Eastern Catholic wooden churches like these, dating back to the 18th and 17th century when most people there were Eastern Catholic. These churches were distinctive to the region. For example, they're not necessarily east-facing, and unlike the wooden churches in Central Europe, which emphasize the profile of the roofs, they emphasize the verticality of the external walls, and they have this distinctive Baroque cupolas, which were very popular during the Counter-Reformation. Belarus, sorry, I just pressed it too. Belarus was actually a country built by wood, and many people were living and worshipping in wooden churches and wooden houses. And inside this church, you will always see an iconostasis screen separating the congregation and the altar. Unfortunately, most of them were destroyed after Chernobyl and also during the Second World War. And the Nazis would quite often lock up all the villagers in their wooden churches before setting them on fire. 1 out of 3 Belarusian was killed, the largest percentage of any nations. And this is a site in London just behind the house, and we were told we were never allowed to build anything there because it's actually surrounded by 17 protected trees rising up to 20 meters. And in order to protect these trees, we had to make sure that the building, the footprint of the building and the construction work stay completely outside the tree roots protection zone. And we also predicted that the new chapel would be overshadowed by the trees most of the time throughout the year. Wood was the obvious choice, not just because of its connection with the country, but also as a lightweight structure, it required only a very shallow foundation. The plan is extremely simple. To the left, we have the entrance porch, which leads to the nave, the congregation, and then there's an iconostasis wall, and then behind the wall will be the altar. The front facades will be largely glazed to maximize daylight penetration. And on top of the bell tower, there will be a distinctive Baroque cupola, which is symbolically very important to Belarusian Greek Catholic. It also serves as an amplifier for a bell inside. And this sketch is showing the intention to have a wavy wall wrapping around the building like a drape. And the idea was taken from observing the wooden churches in Belarus when the moving shadows quite often animated the elevations. I do apologize. The simple profile serves a practical purpose because we have a air source heat recovery unit hidden under the altar, and it blows hot air into the main space, and the bell tower will act as a ventilation stack to regulate air movement. The design of the ventilation grill was inspired by well-known national folk pattern. We went to the Vatican Embassy soliciting for help, and we were very fortunate to be granted a modest budget to build the building. We had to fabricate all the structural members in order to minimize disturbance to the trees. We first erected the low-bearing parts, which are the bell tower to the front and the iconostasis wall to the back, and then we filled them in with cross-laminated timber panels. We really wanted to use this opportunity to celebrate what our hands could do and what technology could achieve with wood. And for the low-bearing parts, they were prepared by local carpenters using locally sourced, freshly sawn Douglas fir. We used a combination of traditional English joinery and engineered joints to achieve stability. And for the cross-laminated timber panels, they were made from radiata pine from Spain, a fast-growing species with a growth cycle of only 8 to 10 years. And for the carcass of the cupola, it was cut by CNC and then clad in Canadian cedars by hand. The whole assembly process only took a few days, and all the parts were cut to a tolerance of 2 millimeters. This is the completed building. The undulating wall was achieved by a very simple trick. We just cut the plans into 2 halves at slightly different angles, and we used a total of only 3 variations. Inside, the opaque glass would diffuse the daylight, and because the cross-laminated timber panels are not low-bearing, we could afford to leave gaps between them to allow more light in, and also it creates the impression that the 1.5-ton walls were lifted off the ground. Eastern Christianity is all about stimulating the 5 senses, so the building is meant to be very tactile from the very first moment when you hold the door handle in your hand, and when you enter the building, it has this intense smell of wood. You can feel the presence of wood. And this building is a response to Chernobyl, and we managed to achieve 100% reduction in gas consumption and 60% reduction in electricity consumption compared to the room they used before. And whenever there is evening service, the only wooden church in London will glow like a beacon, paying tribute to the traumatic memory of the country in the 20th century. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think thank you very much. Thank you. Again. Who would like to ask some questions here? Frederick, yeah.
I think the principle that opened your presentation, the fact that you wanted to do a building that would commemorate a spiritual fundamental dimension of a nation, of a group, is really admirable. And the fact that you traveled and you saw and you drew, you did not use, I believe, a laptop. You do it. I think that explains perhaps why there is a kind of sensitivity in the sort of architectural realism which your building portrays. That could be, of course, judged as obsolete, as something postmodernistic or something of the sort. However, perhaps because we are so overwhelmed by so much trash in the architectural world in the last decades, I think there's a kind of purity in this. There's a kind of naiveness, there's a kind of sincerity, which makes it really achieve its point. I don't mind if it looks, I'm completely ideologically, from an architectural point of view, I don't believe in repeating history, but I don't think I would apply that to this. I think that there is, as I say, a very personal interior concern which required this way of expressing it, and I think it fulfills its point. It really it's very emotional.
Well, that was not a question, but a statement, I think. But nevertheless, but going on about this personal emotions, I'm wondering a little bit. You drew, you traveled there. You got all kinds of inspirations. What happened in the conversation, maybe with the client, or to what point is it not just personal, but also a dialogue with this community, or how does this? I mean, the commemorance of Chernobyl. I didn't quite understand that because it looks like a chapel, but what did they ask you, and how did you talk to this to the community?
I've actually spoken to many Belarusians, both in the UK and abroad, and I interview many of them almost like a journalist. I just want to go back to one slide to illustrate that point. And so I've collected many personal stories. And sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not sure if I get your questions. But so, sorry, what was your question? I do
So my
apologize.
question was, you told a very personal story,
Yeah.
but yet it's also a very specific and symbolic function and building. So what part of it is very personal, the way you have presented it to us, and where is it very particular for this
It's
community,
actually,
this group of people, your clients?
sure. It's actually, the entire project is very personal because it's very difficult to pretend we are rational when we are confronted with. I just want to show you this picture. He's a very good friend now. He's actually a genuine Chernobyl survivor, my friend Alex, and many of these people actually helped me throughout the project, and it's a really true collaboration between the victims, and they gave me lots of opinion. They criticized it. I told the previous judges yesterday, when I first presented my scheme to the community, they just rubbished it. And one of them actually said to me, and he said, "You knew nothing about our culture." So, and they helped me a lot, and I provided about 25 different schemes before I get to that one, and they were totally rubbished by them before. But that dialogue became very personal because they would say something like, if you do that, it will really offend me because it hurts me to see something like that, if that makes sense. That kind of conversation that goes on and on and on and on. And I was very moved the day when he came to the opening, and I could, it was very emotional. Too. Many of them actually travel all the way to the UK to attend the opening ceremony. Yeah.
I feel it's a little bit too literary to interpretation of a trouble. Have you thought about something more than beyond this obvious iconic way of interpretation of the trouble from the past? Because from the drawings you draw, actually are quite similar with what you did in the end. Is it a request from the clients, or?
I actually attempt to come up with something more modernist throughout the process, and the impression I got was that the many members from the community just didn't quite get it. They just tell me, if you come up with something to put it this way, academically correct in architectural terms, they really couldn't relate to it, and it's through that back and forth dialogue I decided to put the academic correctness aside and respect what really resonated in their hearts, if that makes sense.
This is not a question at all, but you've talked a lot about conversation and dialogue. But the metaphor that comes to my mind most strongly is the idea of translation. You know, you not being from Belarus, but also having to translate both a memorial into a living space, a chapel into a space of community. There's a kind of sensibility about this project that's quite hard to name, but very easy to feel. And there's a kind of permeation of sadness about this project, and it seems odd because I think it's a celebratory project.
It's actually very. The two main events, the Second World War and Chernobyl, were the two main themes in Belarusian literature and all that. And in fact, the Nobel Prize winner in literature in 2015, Alexeyevich, is Belarusian. She wrote about Chernobyl and Second World War again and again and again, and she actually she was quoted saying their history is a history of suffering. So it's kind of a mix of melancholy and they use it as a theme to inspire their art, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great answer.
Just one question. Why is it such a really compromised statement? Why does it allow for that undulating edge of the exterior, of the lateral? It's a kind of a balloon frame building, but that undulates on the sides. It's a kind of naughty expression.
I think towards at that stage the trust was already developed, and when I put forward my argument, I said to them, I just feel like straight wall will be really rigid, and I was staring at the wooden churches long enough. You know, I sketched many of them, and every time I sketched them, I felt dizzy because they were all surrounded by trees, and I put forward this personal argument and didn't expect them to say yes, but then they said, "Oh, lovely, let's do it." And I think at that point the trust was already there, so they kind of allowed me to.
Okay, well, that was a nice ending then to your dialogue with them. Thank you very much.